Hello again. Today I'm going to be talking about the Giant Ants. And the Giant Ants are a faction with a lot of queen references, but no way to target your opponent's cards. And when you encounter a faction like this, the first thought is, okay, this faction's going to do much better in multiplayer than in two-player, because when you're only killing minions belonging to one of your three different opponents, that's only a third as good as killing minions belonging to your only opponent. But beyond that, they have a further issue which makes them a multiplayer-focused faction, which is that they tend to have to leave a lot of power in play at the end of their turn in order to accomplish the big things they're designed to accomplish. And specifically as a faction, the Giant Ants are sort of set up to try and abuse this particular card. We Will Rock You. And what it does is it doubles the effect of your power counters until the end of your turn. And pardon the glare here, I didn't bother taking these two out of their slipcovers. These are some of the cards you should consider looking at when you're trying to evaluate how effective We Will Rock You is. Augmentation, the Dinosaurs card, is a +4 power, and that's sort of a standard example of a good burst card. +4 power for one action until end of turn is pretty strong. Genetic Shift, which is +3 power or +1 to all your minions, that's a good example of an average burst card. And as a matter of fact, extra minion play cards tend to be about that +3 too, because +3 is about the average value of a minion in this game. And what that means is that We Will Rock You is going to be an average card if you have 3 power counters in play at the same base. It's going to be a strong card if you have 4 power counters in play. And it's going to be a broken card if you have more than 4 power counters in play. The trick here is that when you're playing against the Giant Ants, you can try to play in such a way as to limit the amount of power counters the Giant Ants can have in play at the start of their turn without you breaking the base on them. And this turns out to work very well because of a particular issue with the Giant Ants minions and the fact that most partner factions for the Giant Ants do absolutely nothing to buff We Will Rock You. Before I go into any more details about how you should play against We Will Rock You to turn it from an overpowered card into a weak to average card, let's take a quick look at the Giant Ants minions, because these are another part that can give you a few red flags. Worker is a 2, that's a printed 0. Keep in mind, if you don't have any synergies that work with power counters, that guy's a blank 2, which is actually really bad. Soldier is a 3, that's a printed 1. Drone is a 4, who's a printed 3, and Drone actually has a useful ability. You can remove a power counter from Drone to prevent the destruction of one of your minions, which is actually a really good ability. And then Killer Queen is also a 4. And Killer Queen has a great looking talent. If you played another minion here this turn, place a +1 counter on this minion and that minion. The only problem with Killer Queen is that the Giant Ants don't have any extra minion plays themselves. So unless you get some from your partner faction, on the turn you play Killer Queen, she's going to be just a 4, who threatens to become a 6 next turn. But the problem with this is you give your opponent a chance to react to her before she becomes even as good as other factions that have mediocre boss monsters. There's usually a pretty specific tactical use for the boss monster in most factions, which is when you're playing defensively in Smash Up in 1v1, it's a lot easier to get a setup where your opponent cannot break and win the base with 2 through 4 power minions than it is to play around every possible hand your opponent has that involves their 5 power minion, especially since normally your opponent has 2 of those in the entire deck. And so a lot of the time you're going to be able to set up in some way so that your opponent needs a 5 power minion to break and win the base. Killer Queen in most Giant Ants decks isn't this 5-power minion, which means that Giant Ants only, in general, have half as much of an opportunity to break through these opposing setups. Furthermore, if we go back to We Will Rock You, Worker is a 0 with 2 counters, that becomes a 4. Soldier is a 1 with 2 counters, that becomes a 5. This is all good, but now we get to the bigger minions. Drone is a 3 with 1 counter, and Drone actually turns into a 5. Drone is no bigger than Soldier when you apply We Will Rock You. Killer Queen is a 4 with no counters. Killer Queen stays a 4 with We Will Rock You. And that 4-5-5-4 distribution is one of the things that you want to play against tactically against the Giant Ants. Because if you know your opponent has some sort of Giant Ants minion and a We Will Rock You in hand, you can predict that these two plays will generate 4 to 5 power plus whatever power they already have in play from power counters that gets doubled by We Will Rock You. And that means you can calculate within an accuracy of only 1 difference in power between the low and high end how much burst your opponent can generate with We Will Rock You. And that in turn makes it so that a lot of the time you can leave a base 1 power total short of what your Giant Ants opponent could break. And this is a lot of the time. That is exactly what I do to opposing Giant Ants decks. I leave them 1 power out of range to break, where if I tried to do this against a less predictable faction like Astroknights, if I tried to leave them exactly 1 power away from what they could break, I'd either be leaving a base with almost nothing on it, or I'd be losing to any unusually good hand they had, and often your opponents will have an unusually good hand. The next point about this tactic of leaving them 1 point away from what they can break is that if you do this in multiplayer, the Giant Ants aren't really going to have a problem with this, and this is why they're an average multiplayer faction and a dead last 2-player faction. When you tactically just barely beat the Giant Ants repeatedly in multiplayer, well, you usually ended up stretching to do that with your deck, and the Giant Ants generally get the 2nd place points. And if you score 2nd place on every base, while one opponent gets first this time, the other opponent gets first the next time, you tend to get to a point where somebody's gotten to 11 or 12 points. You're now 1 base away from the game ending if the right player wins. And the Giant Ants are actually sitting there at about an average score, and if they truly have just scored 2nd place at every base, they've got We Will Rock You in hand. They've probably got a decent setup, and because their opponents are distracted by each other, their opponents can exclusively focus on shutting down the Giant Ants. The Giant Ants are actually going to have quite good chances at scoring a winning base burst at the end. In a 2-player game, if your opponent has beaten you out by 1 or 2 points for winning a base repeatedly, you're dead. You're going to be 6 points behind going into an endgame with no hope of winning it. I apologize for the glare, it's my skylight, and I can't do anything about it. But this game, I'm going to try to show some of the strategy of backing the Giant Ants into a situation where if they advance the power total at a particular base at all, you can respond by breaking and winning it on your turn, and therefore the Giant Ants end up locked into playing elsewhere. And you basically put them in a situation where they can't quite develop fast enough in order to make We Will Rock You a good card. And in this case, the Giant Ant deck is Giant Ant Zombies, which is one of the fastest Giant Ant variants available, although it still has no way to interact with the opponent's cards directly. They can sort of indirectly mess with the opponent if they have Overrun, but that's about it. And not having a lot of reanimation yet, they're going to go after Central Brain before Rhodes Plaza Mall because their opponents, the Dinosaur Mad Scientists, aren't particularly good at dropping a large number of small minions somewhere. They focus a little bit more on growing minions, and so as a result, Rhodes Plaza Mall gets better for the Giant Ant Zombies later in the game in terms of total victory points they can get per turn there, whereas it doesn't really improve for the other deck. So the Giant Ant Zombies want to rush Central Brain first, and Central Brain is a very fast base to break. It's one where getting 4-0'd at it for victory points hurts a lot, so most of the time you can pretty safely guess that your opponent is not going to be able to mess with you there. I'm discarding They Keep Coming to dig deeper in the deck and playing Grave Robbing to get it back. That just, Grave Robbing is a card that doesn't give much tempo anyway. Okay, now, okay, there's a plan beside this play, even though it looks weird as all hell, given the fact that I'm playing it at Rhodes. I know, as the dinosaur mad scientist, that if the Giant Ant Zombies get a lot of time here, they're going to score a lot more victory points than I can here. So I do want to push this closer to its breakpoint. The idea behind the War Raptor Uber Serum is that I have Body Shop in hand. Destroy one of your minions, place a number of +1 power counters equal to that minion's power on your minions. And that is a powerful card that's going to give me the chance to potentially burst Central Brain later, or just burst away Rhodes Plaza Mall so I don't end up badly behind on victory points from it. Here, Rhodes Plaza Mall is a terrific Giant Ant Sting because, we can play a soldier there and then start moving counters off it. I don't have any action I want to play. This, by the way, is already starting to look like Giant Ant Zombies have a very, very good chance of winning the game here. Igor probably has to be played on the Central Brain for defensive purposes. And I am not, even though I have Natural Selection in hand and could kill the soldier, I'm going to choose not to. The important reason why I'm not killing the soldier is the soldier has already moved one counter off of itself, and I know, as that player, that They Keep Coming is in the Giant Ant Zombie's hand. And if they use They Keep, and they currently have no minion in their discard, so that killing the soldier would activate They Keep Coming and also allow them to get an extra counter off the soldier. And generally speaking, giving the Giant Ants extra counters is not something you particularly want to do. Okay, I'm going to 10 here, 10 to 3, and I'm dropping Overrun, because that is going to be a 5 next turn, and the War Raptor Uber Serum play, I think, kind of... that combination triggers either... doesn't trigger. It signals that either they have no hand, or they're holding Body Shop. And Body Shop can lead to some very large bursts happening at Central Brain, and I just want to avoid those via the Overrun. Okay, so... I am at this point, for all intents and purposes, sacrificing the Central Brain as a base. I'm going to put exactly 1 Igor there. Now I have 10 power at Rhodes Plaza Mall. And I'm going to try to break Rhodes Plaza Mall next turn so that the Ant Zombies don't get a big advantage from it. Okay, 10 to 3 here. Again, burst cards are a threat, which means that I would like to break Central Brain this turn if I can. Breaking it will also help activate the Gravedigger. $15 to 3 is not enough to break. 13 to 3 can get burst, but it's hard for them to burst. So I'm going to play the Walker here. Do I want Outbreak? I mean, I like it. It's a good card, but it's not the card I need right now. And I'm going to Lend a Hand, because Lend a Hand is usually not a great card to get Overrun back in my deck. I actually very rarely get around to playing Lend a Hand. But in this case, Overrun is such a good card, and I got it so early that I'm probably going to get good mileage out of having played it here. And I had nothing better to do with my action play. And there's the Missing We Will Rock You, as well as the Tenacious D. Alright, so 4, 8, 10 plus 3 is, it's 13 to 3 right now. So the first question is, can I win this base? This is a 6, so Laceratops into Body Shop will win. This brings me to 8. I don't have to destroy anything because all minions are at least plus 3. Body Shop on this, 6 counters. And this is one of the problems with Solitaire decks. Because this deck doesn't really have any way to directly screw with the opponent's position, this very powerful resource with the threat of Body Shop, even though I tried to play around the Body Shop every turn, I possibly should have played Gravedigger or Drone instead of Walker, but I kind of really wanted to get the deck rolling, because I know my experience with Giant Ant Zombies is you do actually have to get the ball rolling, and when you do, once you do, if you get it rolling in time, you just win. If you don't get it rolling in time, you just lose. We get back... Doesn't really matter where the counter goes because, of course, they don't have any ways to mess with our counters anyway. But that's a 4 to 2. Oh my god, Factory. Okay, now, Giant Ant Zombies have at least now succeeded in having a discard pile. 4, 8, 12 power, so if we can get to 12, we can break it. We're not getting to 12. I'm playing Tenacious Z. They keep coming. Now, I could play Gravedigger with that They Keep Coming, and that was originally my intention when I got the card. But I'm going to play a Walker because that makes it that forces the opponent to commit more resources in order to take a base which flat out helps one deck over the other. And it also gives me a chance to activate an additional Tenacious Z, although I don't succeed in drawing that. I do stick the Walker in the discard because it's not what I want with my end of turn draws. I couldn't break the base, so what I want to do is get the maximum number of minions with the minimum total power on it. Alright, 4, 8, 13 to 5, so I need to drop Laceratops killing the 1. I'm killing the small minion, so it's closer to breaking. It's now 17 to 4, and Howl is generally a worse card than Augmentation in this deck, so I'm going to play it to go to 20, breaking the base. Keep in mind, even though they blew out the base, they only have a 3 to 2 point lead from this base. This has also been a case where the decks with Burst can often get the last word in against the Giant Ant Zombies, even when the Giant Ant Zombies have an awful lot of total power per turn they're dropping. Nevertheless, missing two War Raptors from the deck, it's going to be really hard to effectively contest this big 25 base, which gives the Giant Ant Zombies all sorts of time to develop, and on top of that, they have Killer Queen. Killer Queen's talent This is when I'm going to be talking about the things that help Giant Ants in a partner faction. Tenacious Z is an incredibly good card because Killer Queen cannot use her talent the turn she comes into play if you don't have an extra minion play. So here, Killer Queen ended up being essentially a 6 instead of acting kind of like a blank 4. Do I have anything I want to put back in my hand? Possibly a soldier. Are there any cards that could mess with me? Even if they destroyed the Tenacious Z via their other destruction card, whose name I can't remember right now, we would only really lose 1+1 counter. We don't have a second Tenacious Z activated, so all that is a loss of 1 power. So there isn't much point in playing the Show Must Go On as a defensive play. That is just making our cards unaffected. So it might be beneficial to play Not Enough Bullets to return a soldier to our hand, because we've drawn We Will Rock You, and soldier is bigger relative to We Will Rock You than worker, and equally big as drone. So that's just slightly improving our hand, and by playing something that returned cards to our hand, we're also getting our hand size closer to 10. Once it goes over 10 at the end of our turn, if we have a Tenacious Z in hand, we can activate it by discarding it without having to waste a minion play on playing it first. Okay, so how am I going to contest Factory? I have to contest Factory if this thing gets... Yes, I have to contest Factory because these are Giant Ants. This is probably the best Giant Ant space in the game for 2-player, because if the Giant Ants get off a huge We Will Rock You, they can hit 20-25 power if their opponent doesn't break it quickly enough, and that is 6 or 7 victory points, which would make this 3-point deficit into a lead really, really fast. All right, now let's think about it. He's got 2 minion plays next turn. I'm not really worried about War Raptors. Laceratops isn't going to kill anything, so... But, oh, he's out of Laceratops. So, King Rex, a second the monster, I'm going to be... He has a decent odds of having a 4-power minion virtually via playing, I can't believe I can't remember the name of it, Lab Assistant, there it is. Lab Assistant would be +4 power total at that base. And even though I know as a player that that deck isn't holding it, it's a logical thing that they might have in their hand here. So removing the Uber Serum counter from the monster to drop in 2 Lab Assistants is going to be a total of 12 power, plus the action. Let's give them credit for augmentation in their hand. They could go to 16, which means that they could break it. Technically, they can break this space if we have 9 power, and they have that kind of hand. The other thing I'm observing is if they're holding King Rex, they can break it against the current power we have, which means that I can't defend against a good opposing hand. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, okay, if my opponent has a good hand, they're going to win the game at this point. They're going to break the base, win at 5-2 victory points, take a 12-6 lead, and the game's going to be over. So I'm going to assume, as the Giant Ant Zombies, that my opponent has nothing. And the only question is... do I go for as much power as possible right now? Okay, so if I play Drone, I go to 12 plus the Talon is 14. I don't have a Gimme the Prize. I can't get higher than that. That would allow him to break the base defensively at 11, force him to get to 15. Whereas if I played a Worker, went to 10, he would need to go to 15 to break and win. If he breaks it defensively, if he has to break the base defensively, I like my position following that because he's probably run out of burst cards in order to do that. I just wish I had a way to get to 15 power instead of 14, but okay. If he can make 15, he can win the game. Anyway, play the drone, use Killer Queen's talent. If he breaks defensively, I catch up 1 victory point away from him and reactivate the Tenacious Z, and I have a Gravedigger in hand to get Killer Queen back. So I have a reasonable chance in that end game. I'm not scared of any defensive card he could possibly play right now. So I'm just going to play Gravedigging to get a card from my discard pile into my hand and figure out what do I actually want in my hand. I think it has to be They Keep Coming. It could also be Outbreak, but Outbreak is a little restricted. Draw 2. And I'm also grabbing a Zombie Lord in hand, which is a big deal. Okay. 5, 8, 14. So 11 for the defensive break, and I sort of have to go for this defensive break because right now We Will Rock You plus even just a worker would be crushing amounts of victory point at Factory. And this is the amazing thing. There is actually no minion in hand right now. Do I even have anything? Okay, natural selection, attempting to destroy Tenacious Z. Because there's a counter on it, he decides to just remove a counter from drone. And this is just... You had to recognize... I had to recognize the Giant Ant Zombies that I lost to any good hand, but also recognize that the position after playing an actual good hand was really, really good. Do I have a worker in discard? I do not have a worker in discard, so Zombie Lord is not better than worker if I'm going to play... I'm sorry, I meant soldier in discard, and I don't have either. So Zombie Lord is not going to generate more total power at Factory than just playing a soldier gives me. I'm actually not even calculating before I play this because I know it's got to be the most power I can get. Use the talent, play We Will Rock You, and after I do this, then start counting. 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 17, 19, 20, 22, 24, 26. When things go wrong against the Giant Ants, they go spectacularly wrong, and the kind of play you just saw is exactly why many players consider the Giant Ants to be a strong faction. They just scored 7 points to 2 at this. However, you notice that in order to pull this off, they had to have a totally dead hand with no minions. They had to be worn out and draw badly. And the thing about that is most of the time when your hand is that bad, you're probably losing the game to other factions that aren't the Giant Ants anyway. So it's one of their things. They sometimes win games more flashily than they need to. Lose 3, gain 10, they get 2, and now all of a sudden, the Giant Ant Zombies have a 2-point lead with a Killer Queen, an active Tenacious Z, and a Tenacious Z in the disc. Yeah, what was the third thing? Oh, right, and the Zombie Lord in hand, which their opponent doesn't know about. And here there's only one active base that can catch up to a 13-13 tie, which is the Mothership, and irritatingly enough, they have to draw minions, because they only had Herr Doktor in hand. They just didn't draw minions. Now, we do have to be slightly careful about one thing. Even if we knew they hadn't just drawn minions, they almost certainly have an augmentation at this point, and augmentation would bring them to 11. So we don't want to go to 9. Actually, we can give them credit for probably being able to play another 8. If we can get around that and be able to avoid losing... Wait a minute, if they can play another 8, the counter from this will mean that they can play 9, which means that in order to be safe, we'd have to play down to only 3 power. I might be able to do something cute here. So I figured out that if they have Lab Assistant plus Augmentation, they can go from 7 to 16 power. Now, I don't have any 3s in my hand right now, but I can play a Worker here who improves my reach with We Will Rock You. The We Will Rock You I'm not holding in my hand, granted, but with We Will Rock You by more than any other 2-power minion, only survival of the fittest, that's the only thing that would kill this, and I believe he can't make 20 without... I mean, without the help of a King Rex. And in order to make 20, he's not going to be able to... No, he cannot make 20 and kill the Worker in the same turn. I had to mentally calculate everything involving Laceratops, and Laceratops plus any buff card doesn't make 20, and King Rex doesn't give you 20 given that you have to use your action to kill the Worker. So this is safe. We're not losing the base 4-0. But now I'm going to drop Tenacious Z here. They keep coming. Drop a Killer Queen here. Use Killer Queen's talent, and now I've opened on a second base with 8 power. And Zombie Lord will bring this to 15, plus the transfer of a token brings it to 16 before using an action. Now, the transfer of a token is from playing a soldier at Ninja Dojo. Now, I don't actually currently have anything that can hit 20 in my hand, but this player sure as heck wouldn't know that. So this buys us a turn, and as it turns out, it buys a turn during which the Giant Ant Zombies discover the total lack of minion cards in their opponent's hand. Because nothing happens. Alright, now, do I have any way of making it to 13? Zombie Lord here brings me to 7 and puts 2 counters there. I don't have any movement cards or any extra plays, but I do have a Kind of Magic, which would transfer 4 counters over here. That only makes 11. But I have We Are the Champions, which can transfer away some counters after a base breaks. And I think it's highly unlikely if he wins the Mothership, the game's still tied at 13. And so what I'm going to do, Zombie Lord, playing a soldier here, a Kind of Magic to transfer all my counters to this Worker. And let's turn 5 of these into a 5-counter thing. Now, we have 11, but, and this is likely to lose at this space, but that's okay because We Are the Champions we'll move this base up to 12 at the start of our next turn, which we can hopefully figure out a way to either break that base from 12 or just play it so high that there's no way that they can exceed our power total. And via that, we're going to win the game 16-13 or 16-15. Draw 2. And that draw of We Will Rock You is going to be game over, because there's now no sequence of cards that the Mad Scientist dinosaurs can draw that will save the game. They don't necessarily know this, but the odds at this point that the giant ants have at least drawn at least one of their 2 power transfer specials are pretty high. And I'm just going to check the discard. No, neither power transfer special is in the giant ants discard. And at this point, you know, halfway or more through the deck, it looks like, you know, almost about two-thirds of the way through the deck, the odds that they haven't drawn either power counter transfer special are going to be, you know, something like 1 in 9 at this point. So you can give them credit for having it. And at this point, playing against them, I could calculate, well, the problem is this is going to be 12 at the start of their next turn. And I have to go for the only play in my hand which actually wins this base. Neither of their power counter transfer things can move enough stuff here to win it if they wouldn't have otherwise. So I know that I just need to beat them by 1 going to 12. And I'm going to play Angry Mob. And I'm going to put 5 cards on the bottom of my deck to go to 12. And I'm going to choose that, and that. So I'm keeping every single power increasing card in my hand. Not that it matters. Now, if I also had a minion to play here, a 2-power minion to play here, I might have been in some sort of reasonable situation. But I don't. So this is just going to be score the base. Okay, their special is after the base scores. So he gets his 4, he gets his 2, 13-13 tie after the base scores. Play We Are the Champion. Put 6 counters on this Tenacious Z. Doesn't matter what the new base is really, because whoever wins School of Wizardry, well, they finally drew a minion. Okay, so 12-0 at School of Wizardry. Currently 15, play We Will Rock You. And that makes the power counters worth a total of 16 instead of 8, plus 7 power for minions is 23. And they end up scoring 3 points and winning the game 16-13. So what did we see in this game? I mean, first off, zombies provide, the extra minion play from zombies does an awful lot to accelerate the giant ants, because Killer Queen needs the help of Tenacious Z or some other form of extra minion in order to be good. And when you actually have these extra plays, Killer Queen is a very good card. However, if you noticed during the game, there were a few spots where I had to say, well, if the other deck has a good hand, we're going to get beat here. We have to put them on having a bad hand. And the thing is, most of the time, average or good decks are going to have a good hand more often than not. And when these decks have a good hand, because you end up ending your turn with 10 or 11 power and play at a base, a lot of the time, especially when you're using cards like We Are the Champions to set up, if you have you find yourself in positions where if your opponent can generate a huge power drop and beat you narrowly at a base, you get reset back to almost 0 development. And it's tricky because until you've played some power in play, you don't have a large amount of burst. The Giant Ant Zombies were also very lucky with the bases in that, Central Brain is a nice early base for zombies. Rhodes Plaza Mall is a terrific zombies base. And Factory is a good zombies base and probably the best ants base you can get. And between all of that, they had a very favorable situation. And they still needed some pretty bad draws from the opposing deck in order to win the game. So this is one of those things where they won and you can see the utility of zombies. I think you can also see why a lot of these things that were tactical problems for them wouldn't have been a problem in multiplayer. Because in multiplayer, if the opponent narrowly beats you out of the base, you're getting second place, and that's still good for enough points that you're going to get to the end of the game in pretty good shape. I'm going to stop talking about this game now, and I'm going to get on in the next part of the video to talking about all the different partner factions you can throw with Giant Ants, mainly focusing on, of course, trying to save them in two-player when you're in a situation where you're going to have to draft them, or you might want to draft them in a two-player game, but I'm also going to mention which synergies are useful in a multiplayer game. I've spent a lot of time trying to find good combinations for the Giant Ants in 1v1, and as a side effect, I found some actually pretty terrific multiplayer things. I've got a laundry list of different things that the Giant Ants are missing that they would love to get from their partner faction. Extra minion plays, extra action plays, ways to target the opposing minions, some form of unpredictability, movement, and other ways of providing or using power counters. All of these are things that the Giant Ants would like to get out of their partner faction. They have a little bit of movement themselves, but one card is not enough to be a big threat by itself, and also their movement card only moves a single minion. They would love to get movement cards that can move two or even all their minions at once. In general, if you already have, first off, in two-player, you should never be considering first picking the Giant Ants. You should always be taking them as your second faction after your first faction happens to work well with them. In multiplayer, in a very weak draft set, you might take them first, but I think they're still more likely in most formats that most players play to be your second-picked faction. So I'm going to look at this from the point of view of you already have one faction and you want to say how good are the Giant Ants as partner. In two-player, if you have none of these lists of things that the Giant Ants want for their partner, the Giant Ants are likely to be the absolute worst partner faction you could pick. Worse than Innsmouth, worse than Tricksters, worse than Bears, worse than Ghosts with no synergies, just that bad. Worse than Grannies, yes. If you have just one of those things that the Giant Ants want as a partner, maybe you have extra minion plays, but you don't have any extra action plays and you can't target your opponent's cards at all, and your faction doesn't have any way in which it's unusually unpredictable, the Giant Ants are probably going to be a bottom 5 choice out of the current 50 factions for a partner faction for the faction you already have. On the other hand, at the high end, they can be a lot better. The Pirates check off... Well, oddly, Pirates don't check off extra minion or actions, but the Pirates check off just about everything else the Giant Ants want except extra minion plays and extra action plays. And they also have a strong synergy with First Mate, working great with power counters. For the Pirates, the Giant Ants are probably about the 20th best partner faction you could pick, which for the 50th best faction overall is a terrific synergy. The next best faction I know to pick Giant Ants as a partner for is probably the Mad Scientists, and I would rate the Giant Ants about 30th here. That's already below average, but it's a lot better than most of them. And other factions, something like Wizards, where you can check off a couple of the things on the list, or I'm just looking at a few options. Vampires will give you ways to target the opposing cards, and will give you another way to use power counters. Things like this, Giant Ants are going to be definitely in the bottom third of factions for most random things that have some synergy, but they probably won't be a bottom 5 pick. So they're almost always bad, except with pirates or mad scientists, but still, these lists give you an idea of exactly how bad. If you're comparing a Giant Ants pick to an Innsmouth pick, if you can check off a couple things here, you can safely say that Giant Ants are probably going to be better than Innsmouth. All right, so extra minion plays. Why do we want this? We want this because Killer Queen. Killer Queen is going to be a blank 4 on the turn you play her if you have no way to play an extra minion, because you have to have played another minion here this turn to use her talent. If you have any source of reliable extra minion plays, Killer Queen is a 6 on the turn she comes into play, which makes her a perfectly decent boss minion, and as a matter of fact, she's an 8 if you're playing We Will Rock You on the same turn. So as a result, this gives the Giant Ants a genuine boss monster big drop threat that they're missing without the extra minion play. Extra minion plays also help make Gimme the Prize a better card, as in order to get the full +3 out of it, you need 3 minions in play. When you've got an extra minion play, you can get there in 2 turns instead of 3. This generally means you're going to get to play We Will Rock You a turn earlier as well. And speed is very important. If you remember the tactical examples I've given you, a lot of the time, if the opponent had a turn less to set up, the Giant Ants could have gotten to the point where they were ready to break the base. Usually these things are very close, so it's very helpful to help the Giant Ants develop a turn quicker. And some of your big sources of these are going to be robots and zombies. By the way, extra minion plays plus Giant Ants tend to raise the Giant Ants from an average faction to a very good faction in multiplayer. Zombie Giant Ants are one of the scariest zombie decks to go up against in multiplayer, in my personal opinion, because you've got a fantastic Killer Queen, you've got a fantastic Gimme the Prize, you've got, when you play Zombie Lord and a whole bunch of workers and soldiers come into play, We Will Rock You can become an incredibly broken card. This doesn't work nearly as well in 2-player, mainly just because Zombies and Giant Ants are both solitaire factions that can't target your opponent's cards, and in 2-player this actually becomes relevant. Zombie Giant Ants, when it wins in 2-player, will often win by a lot, but if it gets behind early, you often, without being able to slow your opponent down, you often have no way to buy yourself time to get out of a bad situation. Plants, Innsmouth, Mad Scientists are all also big choices for extra minion plays. Plants is one of the cooler Giant Ants partners because, with the exception of Killer Queen, Sprout can search for any Giant Ants card, and searching for Drone is a lot of fun with your Sprout, especially since once you get a Drone into play, Drone can prevent the destruction of some other Sprout and allow you to mass search for a whole bunch of stuff. I didn't think to pull Sprout out, but you can look it up on the wiki easily if you don't know what it does. Innsmouth, oddly enough, there's actually a lot of synergy there. It just, most of the time it doesn't matter because you're dealing with, in 2-player, 2 really, really bad factions, and you shouldn't be pairing up 2 factions that weak. In multiplayer, if you've got a very weak draft pool to pick from and you ended up first picking Giant Ants, Innsmouth is less bad for you than it would be for a lot of other starting factions. Mad Scientist, one of the factions for whom Giant Ants is a top partner. Horses, that's a possible first pick where you're going to be slightly less sad to get the Giant Ants than otherwise because it has a whole bunch of different ways to draw to play extra minions in the same turn. Halflings, Mages, Ignobles, Teddies. I delayed making this video a little bit because I wanted to try Giant Ant Ignobles to make sure that it wasn't some sort of insane juggernaut, because the Ignobles check off so many of the things the Giant Ants want. It is, in fact, a little bit better than the sum of its parts, but it's not super scary. It's not a top Giant Ants partner. And then there's another 20 factions that I have marked as having extra minion plays, but not a tremendous number of them. You know, technically you've got extra minion plays in Vampires, Miskatonics, Shapeshifters, Wizards, etc., but they aren't a big focus of the faction. And so Probably half of your different possible partner factions are going to provide this, but the 10 I listed are the ones that are going to provide this in a major, powerful way. Next option, extra action plays. Now, the key with extra action plays is that when somebody goes and makes a list of all the factions with every action play, they usually just sort of say every faction that has stuff that says play an extra action. And the Giant Ants want a specific kind of extra action. They want extra action plays that allow the Giant Ants to play 2 Giant Ants actions in the same turn. Usually, these 2. Give me the prize, place a +1 power counter on up to 3 of your minions, followed by We Will Rock You, double the effective power counters until the end of your turn. Because the extra action that lets you play Give Me the Prize is going to give you +4 or +6 power, depending on if you had, +4 if you only have 2 minions in play at the base you want to break, +6 if you have 3 or more, and that is a huge benefit from the extra action. So something like Wizard's Time Loop that just gives you 2 extra actions that you can spend on anything, or Wizard's Chrono Mage, he comes into play with your minion play, he lets you play 2 actions. These are the extra actions that are really good for the Giant Ants. Just a card that says, do this, and then play an extra action, but the card used your action play in the first way, that's not a useful extra action for Giant Ants in the same way. And for these, Wizards and Ignobles are the 2 factions that are going to let you do really good things. Ignoble Giant Ants are going to be able to occasionally make crazy plays, but when I tried to make them work, they seem to be a little slow to set up. However, Giant Ant Wizards are legitimately a pretty powerful deck in multiplayer, and Giant Ants are not a horrible Wizards partner, even in 2-player. I don't think they're quite Mad Scientist good as synergy, but Giant Ants are probably about the 35th best Wizards partner, rather than the 50th as an overall partner for an unknown faction. And then you can get some interesting extra actions out of a number of other different sources. Ghosts, Cthulhu, Miskatonic, Kitty Cats, Fairies, Mages, Greeks, Astronites, Changerbots, Grannies. That's a lot of factions that have some form of useful extra action, but aren't going to be able to consistently every game pull off a Gimme the Prize, We Will Rock You combination. Most random factions do not have useful extra actions for the Giant Ants. I think I counted that 12 out of the 49 possible partner factions provided the Giant Ants with some form of useful extra actions, not counting the Munchkin factions that can use Dwarf Hireling in hand paired with Boots of Butt Kicking in discard to play the Dwarf Hireling, pull the Boots of Butt Kicking out of the discard onto the Dwarf Hireling, and get an extra action that lets them play 2 actions per turn off of this trick. That's a great trick to remember, but most games with a Munchkin faction, you're not actually going to be able to pull this trick off. So I didn't count Munchkin factions as a source of useful extra actions, but you still should remember that trick. Now we have not solitaire, meaning when I say a solitaire faction, I mean a faction that can't or at least shouldn't target your opponent's cards. And with the sole exception of Mad Scientists, all of these factions do better in multiplayer than in 2-player. Now, this is a synergy where having a non-solitaire partner faction for your Giant Ants will make your Giant Ants less bad in 2-player, but it isn't really an important thing to have in a 3-player or 4-player game, because in multiplayer you do not need to target your opponent's cards to win. Zombies don't provide a way to target your opponent's cards, but if I'm going to be scared of Giant Ants coming in as a second pick in a multiplayer game, Zombies is the #1 first pick against which I'm sitting here going, I really do not want to see Giant Ants as my opponent's second faction. So some of the big options, Aliens and Geeks, they're so overpowered in 2-player, but it turns out that Giant ants actually work better with them than a lot of other factions because the aliens and geeks have so many ways to target the opponent's cards, they don't need any more of it from their partners. Ninjas, pirates, kitty cats, princesses, sharks, ignobles, and warriors, with me having written down a note to explain this. Warrior giant ants are actually a pretty strong non-solitaire synergy, but it isn't because the warriors directly target your opponent's cards. The point of having a way to target your opponent's cards is so that you can choose on your turn whether you push bases towards breaking or away from it. Warriors can push bases away from breaking without ever targeting your opponent's cards, just by slamming a whole bunch of monsters on whatever base your opponent wants to break. This has the double side effect that when breakpoints go large, the giant ants start to get a lot better in a two-player game. If every base had a breakpoint of 25 or higher, enough minion power would land on these bases before they broke that We Will Rock You would always be at least a strong card. You would expect to constantly get at least +4 out of it. And so when the warriors come through and they just slow the game down, now that giant ant slow buildup that normally only devastates you if you have a bad hand or you don't know how to play against the giant ants is going to be doing big things just about every base. And I've got to add in the caveat that I have never actually played warrior giant ants, but theoretically speaking, the giant ant should be a decent partner faction for the warriors. And I'm not going to try to estimate exactly where it falls, just that giant ants are definitely not going to be a bottom 10 partner for the warriors. And there's a whole bunch of other factions that have ways to target your opponent's cards. And in general, all of these are going to make the giant ants less bad in 1v1. Of course, all of these factions are also going to have the side effect of making other possible factions like zombies better partners for them in 1v1. That is, there are a lot of better solitaire factions for 1v1 to pick than the giant ants. And then I've got another note, which is unpredictability. And when I'm talking about temporary defensive setups where you set up the base so that the giant ants are 1 power away from being able to break it, that's your best way to destroy the giant ants in 1v1. And if you happen to pick an unpredictable faction like Astroknights, where if you're trying to guess at how much power the Astroknights can generate next turn, you have a hopeless situation. To a lesser degree, something like the Greeks. The Greeks are also very unpredictable. General theme of why the Greeks and Astroknights are so unpredictable is because they have a lot of extra actions that aren't the type that the giant ants want to use in order to double up on Give Me the Prize, We Will Rock You. But these little extra actions mean that the difference between a bad Greek's hand and a good Greek's hand is pretty wide. The difference between a bad Astroknight's hand and a good Astroknight's hand is pretty wide. And of course, the Astroknights also have a very powerful movement card in their Han Solo clone, whose name is escaping me at the moment. Unpredictability means that the particular way your opponent wants to play against your giant ants isn't going to work as consistently because they will end up playing right into your partner factions. And so that's one reason why Giant Ant Astroknights are one of the best Giant Ants decks out there, I think. And then movement. Pirates, Astroknights, Tornadoes, with the caveat that Giant Ant Tornadoes do not seem to work. Because both the giant ants and tornadoes are a little bit slow. Movement is very valuable because if you know your opponent is trying to put you in a position where any additional minion played at your main base results in the opponent breaking it on their turn, but you still need to keep developing or you'll never get anywhere, now you can play at additional bases, and with these movement abilities, your movement abilities threaten more and more virtual power drop via movement every single turn. So you still have useful ways to develop on the board, even when your opponent is trying to lock you down tactically via, Hopefully I covered some of that in the examples that happened between the intro and this part of the video. Movement is a very useful thing for the giant ants. It's going to be useful in multiplayer too, although in multiplayer I would still rather have access to more extra minions and more extra actions than I would to have access to movement. And of course, power counters are also good. We Will Rock You doubles all power counters that you have, whether they come from your giant ants or whether they come from your mad scientists or Greeks or any other faction that can generate them. Vampires are too weak a faction in their own right to carry the giant ants, even with this power counter synergy, but mad scientists are a strong enough faction that mad scientist giant ants start becoming pretty darn good. I think that's all the specific synergies you're looking for. In general, if you want the giant ants to be a decent faction in 1v1, you're going to need 2 or more of these in pretty decent quantities. When you get almost the whole laundry list, like Pirates does, and also have a strong individual synergy with First Mate, you're going to get something very, very good. But it's also worth noting, after I cover these power counters, that the giant ants focus on power counters means you also have 2 factions that you do not want to go up against with the giant ants if you can at all avoid it. And actually, you don't want to go up against these 2 factions with any power counter faction if you can avoid it. And I'm talking about aliens and time travelers. Now, aliens are so good in 2-player that you normally don't want to go up against them anyway unless you have very powerful factions to take them on with. But time travelers are not a top-tier faction, although they are an excellent partner faction for both the aliens and the geeks, which means that they show up in some top-tier decks. The thing is, these factions have targeted ways to return your stuff to your hand, and part of the giant ants buildup involves their minions having more power counters in play than they had when they originally came into play. And this means that the aliens' power and time travelers can bounce your buffed minions, and you don't get to keep those power counters. The power counters don't go back to your hand, just the minion card itself. And this means that time travelers and aliens can slow down giant ants more than they slow down other factions. And since it's important to have tempo against both of these 2 factions, both of these factions tend to do very well in long games, they're going to be fairly hard counters to the giant ants. I try to avoid having giant ants in any game against time travelers. Time travelers are really the important one to avoid, because if you've got giant ants against aliens, you're massively outclassed in faction ranks anyway. You can try defending your power counter minions with the Star Roamers, but this may work against time travelers, but I would still rather have a faction that has some synergy with the giant ants and not be facing targeted bounce. You do not need to worry about the Star Roamers bounce in the same way, because the Star Roamers bounce isn't able to target specific cards of yours. The Star Roamers can't choose what they bounce, and so you can, take all your counters off a soldier, return that soldier to your hand, and now you've basically got extra power counters when you play the soldier. So Star Roamers bounce doesn't counter you.